What's up guys, this is SkyTech Freak and today we're going to be building in and slightly modifying the Zotac ZBox Magnus 1 bare bones kit. But this is actually more bare bones than the Magnus 1 comes when you buy it. And what I mean by that is that the Magnus 1 basically comes as a fully functional PC. So there's a motherboard, there's a PSU, there's the case, and then of course the biggest selling factors are that it comes with an RTX 3070 GPU and a 10700 CPU, and at least that's the model I got. There's also a model beneath it which comes with a 10400 CPU and a 3060 CPU. So that's how the Magnus 1 is sold by Zotac. So all you need to do is add storage and add RAM to it, which will allow you to then have a fully functioning PC. And like I said, at the time that I bought it, I was able to buy it before the GPU apocalypse sort of began, like a year and a half, 2 years ago. And I purchased the 10700 RTX 3070 version. And I was using it for a while, but then again, like I said, the GPU apocalypse started and I realized that if I sold the RTX 3070, I could make a lot of money on that. So I did that. I sold it secondhand. I did earn a little bit of money from that, but I was still using the Zotac ZBox Magnus 1 sort of with the 10700 and integrated graphics in it just to do like computing tasks. I used to do a lot of editing on it and stuff like that, and given that I'd already gotten rid of the GPU, the CPU would get pushed pretty hard because there was no GPU to encode the videos I was editing and stuff like that. So when I started using the Magnus 1 without the GPU for some of these intensive CPU tasks, I realized that the 10700 was actually thermal throttling, and the CPU cooler fan would just ramp up really fast and make a lot of noise because it was trying to keep that CPU from overheating, and as a result it would thermal throttle. It was not able to keep the CPU from thermal throttling, so it would still thermal throttle, but at the same time this fan would just go crazy and make like insane amounts of noise. So that's when I started to wonder, like, maybe I should investigate what's wrong, because this is the stock cooler that comes with the ZBox. There's no way they would ship a cooler that isn't adequate to cool the CPU that they themselves have put in the box. So I decided to investigate. I popped open the side panel, and that's when I took my first like proper look at the CPU cooler that comes with the Magnus 1. So I'd already seen it when I was installing like the RAM and storage and stuff like that, but I didn't really give it a second thought. So this is the first time I looked at it properly, and you know, when I had looked at it the first time, I thought that the cooler would be pretty adequate. It's this cooler, but then I realized that this whole edge is actually not part of the cooler. It's just the heatsink, and the fan is actually a fan that they've made a hole in the heatsink and pressed like a tiny fan inside it, right? So I was like, wait a minute, this isn't going to be able to cool the 10700 at all. And so I did a comparison with other low profile sort of coolers or stock coolers that come with other systems, and you'll see that here, just in terms of the height of the two coolers, clearly the CPU heatsink has just been like hollowed out and a fan has been put inside it, as compared to the AMD Wraith Stealth, and this is just the Stealth version, so their cheapest stock cooler. First of all, you can see that the radius of the fan is much bigger on the AMD side versus on the Zotac side, which is like a tiny radius of fan. And then as you can see, the middle part where the motor of this fan is huge, and then the fans are only like so big, as opposed to AMD when like the middle portion is also fairly large, but at least the fan blades get to be pretty long. And so I looked at it and I was like, well, the AMD cooler is clearly far superior than this. And I was like, hold on, this fan is actually reminding me of the Intel stock cooler. So I pulled that out from one of the Intel boxes that I have, and mine's a little dirty, but literally the fan radius and size seems almost the same. While this is a flatter fan and the curve on the blades is a little different, but in terms of like the heatsink size and with the fan, because even though the stock Intel cooler is a little taller, the fact that they've made a hole in the heatsink and put the fan in, I would say there's probably like very comparable amounts of surface area of the heatsink in both these coolers. And we already know how much noise like the Intel stock cooler makes, and I'll be honest, I felt like the Zotac cooler was making comparable amounts of noise to that. And so then I was like, why would they, if they're gonna make something that's like barely better than the Intel stock cooler, or not even better than the Intel stock cooler, why would they like bother making it and installing it in their case and promising that it's going to be able to cool something like the 10700? And I will give you the fact that this feels like a premium heatsink. It's heavy, it's dense, and it looks a lot cleaner. It's much more stealthy than this like weird black edged Intel cooler with the silver heatsink. So it does look really good, but like if it's functionally redundant, then it doesn't matter what the cooler looks like if if it's not going to work, or if it's going to work poorly and make a lot of noise, and not let the CPU that you've paid for and you've put in your Magnus One perform to the best of its ability. So I was like, okay, clearly this isn't going to work. I wasn't going to replace it with an Intel stock cooler, so I was like, let me pick up another like low profile cooler. And this is something that I use in a lot of Intel SFF builds. So basically this is a cooler called the i70, and it's actually got a 120 fan along with a pretty deep heatsink. So I picked one of these up. It's not expensive. I always recommend these if you don't want to go for like, if you're using a mid-range sort of CPU and you don't have a lot of money to spend on like an AIO or a tower cooler, or a tower cooler won't fit in your SFF build. I usually suggest that people pick up this Cooler Master i70. It's like 700 something rupees right now. It's very cheap, and it's got such a deep heatsink and a 120 fan that I really think that this is one of the better coolers out there for low profile builds at a budget. But I realized that even after I picked this one up, that the Zotac Magnus one actually requires a very, very low profile cooler. So this is like almost double the height. And of course, that's because there isn't a hole in the heatsink of this one, because this is actually a decently made cooler as opposed to this one. And even though the mounting holes, etc., were all the same, I realized that the Magnus one's like side panel wouldn't shut if I installed this cooler on it, because it needs to be something like similar to the height of this one. At least at the time, because I was facing so many thermal issues with the 10700, I went ahead and took that out of the Magnus one as well and sold the 10700, because I was like, currently I can't really find a cooler that's going to be able to cool it. But I searched online, a lot of people were facing the same thing, where the CPU cooler, as I've shown you, was like just inadequate, making a lot of noise and making the CPU thermal throttle. So I got rid of the 10700, and I was like, maybe I'll just get like a 10400 or 10500. But then I read online that even people with the 10400 3060 model, they were also facing the same CPU fan noise issue. So I was like, if I ever have to rebuild in the Zotac Magnus One, I will need to pick up an alternate CPU cooler. And that's when I saw a video by Tech Notice where they picked up the same CPU, the same Magnus One, and what they had gone ahead and done is installed a Noctua NH-L9I on it, which is, again, I'm sure I'll be able to show you in just a second, a very, very low profile cooler. And that, of course, although it doesn't cost 700 rupees like the i70, it is not a cheap cooler, but it is a low profile cooler that is comparable in terms of the dimensions, at least the height of the CPU cooler that the Magnus one comes with. And of course, when it comes to comparing the fans, there's just no comparison. This is a Noctua fan on the Noctua cooler versus whatever dinky little thing this one is that was quite useless and noisy. I know for a fact that this fan is going to be able to cool, and it's going to stay extremely, extremely silent, given that it is Noctua. So I picked this one up as one of the upgrades I do for the Magnus One. Anyway, cut to when I don't have a CPU or GPU in the Magnus One. I wait for a year for things to get better in terms of prices, and I finally pick up a 10500. So I realized that, you know, if a 10700 was thermal throttling in it, maybe a 10500 would work in it, especially with the Noctua cooler. So I picked one of the 10500s up, and I went ahead and actually found a 3060 Ti for the GPU for this. This is an HP OEM card, so it's not one of the best cards out there, like not by a long shot. It's just about like the lowest end of a 3060 you can get, but I picked it up pretty cheap, and I was like, okay, so I had the Zotac 3070 10700 model, and Zotac also sells a 10400 3060 model, so I'm basically building a Zotac Magnus One that comes bang in the middle of it with a 10500 instead of a 10400 or 10700, and a 3060 Ti instead of a 3060 or a 3070. Now I would have liked to put an 11th gen CPU in the Magnus One, but the Magnus One's motherboard is a B460, and that doesn't support Intel 11th gen, which is just annoying, because then the B460 basically only supported one gen of Intel CPUs, which is like bad practice, but I guess that's Intel for you. Even though the socket size for 10th and 11th gen is the same, and Z490 is able to support 11th gen, for some reason they decided for B460 will not be able to support 11th gen. And so that's that. Again, just a quick recap of the parts then. 3060 Ti for the GPU, 10500 for the CPU. I have found myself some storage, so I'm going to be adding 2 drives of NVMEs. So the Magnus One has 2 NVMe slots, and I'm going to be adding a 500 GB WD SN570 for the boot drive, and then a 1 TB SN570 for like games and stuff. And it also has one 2.5-inch slot, and usually that's populated by an SSD, but I bought a 2.5-inch notebook HDD, which is also 1 TB, just so that I can have a bunch of storage space and I don't have to spend that kind of money for an SSD. As for the RAM, earlier when I was using this, I had a 10700 in it, so it could overclock to 3000 megahertz. So I had 2 sticks of 8 GB 32 megahertz crucial RAM, which would get downclocked to 3000 megahertz. So those were those crucial sticks. But now that I'm using an i5, another thing about the B460 is that it only lets i7 processors overclock to 3000 megahertz. So i5 processors can only have their RAM running at 2666 megahertz. The Zotac Magnus one also only accepts laptop RAM. So I picked up 2 of these Ripjaws laptop RAMs, which run at 2666 megahertz, and they are in fact 16 GB each. So as opposed to having 2 sticks of 3000 megahertz total 16 GB, I now have 32 GB of RAM by picking up 2 of these sticks. So that's the stuff I'm going to be putting in the Magnus One. I'd also sold the antennas for the Magnus One. I also thought those antennas were too big, so I went ahead and picked up 2 of these like smaller antennas that I think would work much better and look much better in the Magnus One. It already comes with a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth card, but someone needed the antennas, so I took them out and gave them for them to use on their motherboard, and then I've picked up these smaller antennas that I think would work well with the Magnus One's small SFF type footprint. So yeah, that's all the stuff I'm going to be doing to build in the Magnus One. So now let's go ahead and start building, and I'll see you guys there. So I finally got done building in the Zotac Magnus One, and I think it turned out quite well. As you can see, these 2 antennas actually look quite good on it. They give sort of like a cute air robot Wall-E effect. But it actually took me longer than I thought it would, because when I was first building it, when it came as a bare bones kit, it had the CPU and cooler and the GPU already installed. So all I had to do was put in storage and RAM. And I thought that maybe this will not take that much longer, because all I have to do is put in a processor, and then putting in the GPU would take no time at all. And then I just had to put the storage and the RAM again as well. But what I didn't realize is that to install the Noctua cooler that I did, I actually had to remove the motherboard, and the motherboard itself in this computer sort of sits inside like a PCI slot. So it like stands upwards and slots into another PCI-ish looking slot at the bottom. And I knew that I had to remove the motherboard to install the cooler, because you have to remove the stock backplate that comes with the cooler that I told you is trash on this computer. So you have to remove that backplate and then install like Noctua's screws from the back. So I knew that I had to remove the motherboard, but I didn't expect the motherboard removal to be such a long process. The main reason for that is that the way they've routed these like antenna cables for the Wi-Fi card is like through a bunch of holes and stuff within the CPU case itself. So I had to go and like clip and remove a bunch of these zip ties and be very careful that I don't cut any of the antenna cables, and I'd like very carefully remove them just so that I was able to like sort of finagle the motherboard out from the case, because otherwise it was getting stuck to the case because of the way that all these cables were like tied within it. Something else I ran into that I spent a lot of time on was basically the way that the fans on top of this case work is by connecting to these like magnetic points on the motherboard. And I hadn't actually done anything to it, but the points weren't making proper contact. It's possible when I removed the motherboard that I like misplaced it. I didn't put it back properly, but then I tried to remove it and replace it as well, and it still didn't actually make any difference. So what I had to do was actually remove the screws here and then reseat this part that makes contact with the pins, and bring it down lower. So I had to use some 3M like adhesive and just move it down a little lower so that the contact was made properly. So I actually took off the side panel and I was looking, and I saw that this point is a little higher than it should be. So I just moved the connection point. I took out the screws and moved the connection point lower and stuck it with some 3M double-sided tape. So yeah, that was another thing that took me really long to identify, because like it sounds easy when I'm telling you that that's all I had to do, but the identifying process of why it's not working and then how to fix it and all took me a long time. Now I know this is not like a case with a glass tempered side panel where you can actually see the PC inside, so it doesn't really matter what it looks like, but I still think that it's like a very symmetric, good looking build. You can see the rip jaws rams are black. I was thinking if I had the two crucial RAM sticks that I did have, those would be green and those would match maybe with the HDD and the Wi-Fi card. And if I got like WD green NVMEs, then that would all be like an inside green PC. But then green isn't exactly the most attractive color. I like the blue on the NVMEs and on the ripjaw sticker a lot more. Plus, again, like I said, doesn't really matter. But another thing that, you know, I'm a little bit OCD about these things, but another thing that I thought really came together well was the fact that the Noctua fans never have a sticker on the middle of their motor, and neither do these fans that have come with it. So I just feel like all of these fans together, including the one on the GPU, and this is something that I was initially a little skeptical of, because I was like, okay, maybe I replace the fans, or maybe I find some fan stickers to put on these HP fans. But as you can see, they're all sort of very similar looking black nondescript fans, and I just feel like in the build it goes together really well, because on top there's two of these fans, on the side there are two of these fans, and then in front of the CPU there's this CPU cooler over here, and I just really like sort of the way that it looks. So yeah, like I was saying, I think that the case looks really good. And again, you guys might be like, why does that matter? If you're just going to close it, you could just have different like non-symmetrical parts inside the PC case and no one would care. And that's true, but like I would know. And so the fact that this PC case has come together so nicely and all the parts seem like they fit together so well, I really like the way that this PC started looking from inside and I'm done building it. Other than that, I did run some benchmarks, and obviously we know that the 10500 in 2022 isn't the most blazing fast performer for computing tasks. I actually have a 5900X in my main system, so it's not like the 10500 was going to blow me away as it is. Plus it's a mid-range CPU and it's sort of restricted by being in a small form factor case. So yeah, I wasn't expecting it to be like a next level champ, but it is a very, very adequate CPU just for gaming, and that's all I'm going to be doing in this system. A lot of my video editing and all will now happen obviously on my bigger main computer, the one I told you has a 5900X. So just for gaming as a secondary PC and just for some HTPC stuff and watching some movies and stuff, I think this PC is going to be very, very adequate. Another thing that I will have to do when I ran the 3D Mark benchmark is the fact that this 3060 is underperforming as compared to other 3060s, and that's got to do with the fact that it is a very small cooler on that card and it is a low-end card, and the fans I don't think are very, very strong fans. So I will have to undervolt it. I will update you with the results of that undervolting, and I'll let you know how this starts performing once I've optimized it properly, because all I've done right now is sort of just booted into Windows. I mean, installed Windows first, booted into Windows, run a few games, run a few benchmarks, and seen that nothing has gone fundamentally wrong, which it hasn't. But apart from that, I do think the build is over. Everything else that just has to happen has to be software optimization. One thing that was very, very successful was the fact that the CPU cooler is now dead silent. I can sometimes hear, or not sometimes, as soon as I push the computer with enough of a heavy task, I can hear the top fans ramping up, which is after I fixed the fact that they weren't making contact. But now that they're making contact with the correct pins, I can hear them sort of ramp up when I push the PC too hard, but it's not nearly as obnoxious as the sound that was coming out of that CPU cooler, because the top fans are also 90mm like slim fans as opposed to like 60mm hole in the heatsink fans. So Obviously, if that was trying to get any work done, it would be screaming. But yeah, these aren't so obnoxious. Some people have had issues with the PSU making noise. I haven't faced that at all, so I guess I just got lucky with my unit. But other than that, yeah, I think that's all for the build today. Leave a like if you guys like the build, and if you might try something like that on your own Zotac one, or if you want a PC like this, let me know what I should make a video on next. Consider subscribing, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks.